Commander Takeo Yoshikawa sat in a small office in Tokyo in December 1945, staring at a document that had just been declassified by American occupation authorities. The document was a translation of Japanese naval communications from May and early June 1942, communications that had been intercepted, decrypted, and read by American intelligence officers before the Battle of Midway. Yoshikawa had served as a naval intelligence officer throughout the war. He had worked in the communications intelligence section of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had been responsible for analyzing enemy communications and for assessing Japanese cryptographic security. He had been competent at his job. He had been diligent. He had done everything that Japanese military protocol required. And he had completely failed to detect that American cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes. The document in front of Yoshikawa was devastating in its implications. American intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications detailing the planned attack on Midway Island. American cryptographers had decrypted these communications. American naval commanders had used this intelligence to position American aircraft carriers in ambush positions northeast of Midway. American forces had achieved complete strategic surprise, not because Japanese operational security had failed, but because American cryptographers had read Japanese naval communications as if they were reading a newspaper. Yoshikawa read the document twice. Then he read it a third time. Each reading confirmed what he had suspected for 3 years but had been unable to prove during the war. The Americans had broken Japanese codes. The Americans had known Japanese plans. The Americans had used this intelligence advantage to achieve decisive victory at Midway. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4th to June 7th, 1942, had resulted in the destruction of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and the deaths of approximately 3,000 Japanese sailors and pilots. The battle had been the turning point of the Pacific War. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive. After Midway, strategic initiative passed to the Americans. After Midway, Japanese defeat became inevitable. Yoshikawa had spent 3 years wondering why Midway had gone so catastrophically wrong. Japanese planning had been sound. Japanese forces had been superior in numbers. Japanese commanders had been experienced and capable. Yet the Americans had been waiting in exactly the right position. American aircraft carriers had ambushed the Japanese fleet. American dive bombers had destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in a matter of minutes. Now, reading the declassified American intelligence document, Yoshikawa understood. The Americans had known. The Americans had read Japanese communications. The Americans had known Japanese plans before Japanese commanders had executed those plans. The war, Yoshikawa realized with a sinking feeling, had been lost not on June 4th, 1942, when Japanese carriers burned, but in the months and years before Midway, when American cryptographers had systematically broken Japanese naval codes, and Japanese intelligence had failed to detect this catastrophic security breach. To understand how American cryptographers broke Japanese codes, it's necessary to understand what Japanese cryptographic systems were and how they operated. The Imperial Japanese Navy used a code system designated JN-25 by American cryptographers. JN-25 was a complex code that involved 2 stages of encryption. First, Japanese messages were encoded using a codebook that converted words and phrases into 5-digit numbers. Second, these numbers were then encrypted using an additive table that added random 5-digit numbers to the encoded message. The system was designed to be secure. Even if an enemy intercepted Japanese communications, they would need both the codebook and the additive table to decrypt the message. Without both, the message would appear to be random numbers. Japanese naval cryptographers believed that JN-25 was secure. They believed that even if Americans intercepted Japanese communications, Americans would not be able to decrypt them. This belief was based on the assumption that the mathematical complexity of the system made it essentially unbreakable. But this assumption was wrong. American cryptographers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been working on JN-25 since before the war began. American cryptographers had intercepted thousands of Japanese naval communications. American cryptographers had analyzed these communications, looking for patterns, repetitions, and mathematical relationships that could reveal the structure of the toad. By early 1942, just before the Battle of Midway, American cryptographers had achieved sufficient understanding of JN-25 that they could decrypt enough of Japanese communications to understand Japanese strategic planning for the Midway operation. Japanese naval intelligence, including Commander Yoshikawa's section, was completely unaware that American cryptographers had achieved this level of success against JN-25.
The Japanese plan for the Midway operation was strategically sound. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, intended to lure the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle by attacking Midway Island. Yamamoto believed that if Japan could destroy the remaining American aircraft carriers, America would be forced to negotiate a peace settlement favorable to Japan. The plan involved multiple Japanese naval forces approaching Midway from different directions. The main carrier striking force, commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, would attack Midway with aircraft from 4 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. A separate invasion force would land troops on Midway to capture the island. Admiral Yamamoto's main battleship force would remain in reserve, ready to engage the American fleet if it appeared. The plan was complex and required precise coordination between multiple Japanese forces spread across hundreds of kilometers of ocean. But Japanese naval commanders were confident. They had experience. They had superior numbers. They believed they could achieve strategic surprise. What Japanese commanders did not know was that American cryptographers had been reading their communications for weeks. American intelligence knew that Japan was planning an operation against an objective designated AF in Japanese communications. American cryptographers suspected that AF was Midway, but they needed confirmation. Commander Rochefort devised a clever plan. American forces at Midway were ordered to send an uncoded message reporting that Midway's water distillation plant had broken down. Japanese forces intercepted this message and sent a coded communication reporting that AF was experiencing water problems. American cryptographers intercepted this coded Japanese message, decrypted it, and confirmed that AF was indeed Midway. With this confirmation, American naval commanders knew exactly where the Japanese attack would occur. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, positioned American aircraft carriers northeast of Midway in ambush position. American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown waited for the Japanese fleet to arrive. When the Japanese carrier striking force approached Midway on the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese commanders believed they had achieved surprise. They believed the American carriers were far away. They believed they could attack Midway, refuel and rearm their aircraft, and then engage any American forces that responded. They were wrong. The American carriers were already in position. American dive bombers were already launching. American forces were already attacking. The Battle of Midway lasted from June 4th to June 7th, 1942. The decisive action occurred on the morning of June 4th when American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown attacked the Japanese carrier striking force. Japanese carriers were caught in a vulnerable moment. Japanese aircraft had just returned from attacking Midway and were being refueled and rearmed on the carrier's decks. Fuel lines were open. Ordnance was scattered across the decks. The carriers were extremely vulnerable to attack. American dive bombers arriving at almost the same moment from different directions attacked the Japanese carriers. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were hit by multiple bombs and set on fire. The bombs ignited fuel and ordnance on the carrier's decks, creating massive explosions and uncontrollable fires. By the end of June 4th, all 3 carriers had been abandoned and were sinking or burning. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack against the American carrier Yorktown and severely damaged it. But American aircraft from Enterprise located Hiryu and attacked it, setting it on fire. Hiryu was abandoned and sank the following day. In a matter of hours, Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, approximately 250 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 sailors and pilots. The Japanese combined fleet, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, had been decisively defeated. Japanese commanders were shocked. Admiral Nagumo, who survived the sinking of his flagship Akagi, could not understand how the Americans had been in the right position at the right time. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of the disaster, ordered a general retreat. The invasion of Midway was canceled. The Japanese fleet returned to Japan in defeat.
Commander Yoshikawa, working in naval intelligence in Tokyo, received reports of the Midway defeat with growing alarm. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented. 4 carriers lost. The cream of Japanese naval aviation destroyed. The strategic initiative in the Pacific irreversibly shifted to the Americans. Yoshikawa analyzed the battle reports. He studied Japanese operational communications. He reviewed Japanese planning documents. And he began to suspect something that he could not prove. The Americans had known. The timing of the American ambush was too perfect. American carriers had been in exactly the right position. American dive bombers had attacked at exactly the moment when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. The probability of this occurring by chance was extremely low. Yoshikawa prepared a confidential report for his superiors. In this report, he suggested that American intelligence might have compromised Japanese communications security. He suggested that JN-25 might have been broken. He suggested that Japanese cryptographic procedures should be reviewed and strengthened. The report was received and filed. No significant action was taken. Japanese Naval Command did not believe that JN-25 had been broken. Japanese cryptographers continued to use JN-25 throughout the war, making only minor modifications. Yoshikawa continued to suspect that American intelligence had an advantage. He continued to analyze battle outcomes and operational results. He continued to see patterns that suggested American foreknowledge of Japanese plans. But he could not prove it. He could not access American intelligence systems. He could not definitively demonstrate that Japanese codes had been broken. And so the war continued. Japanese forces continued to use JN-25. American cryptographers continued to read Japanese communications. American commanders continued to use this intelligence advantage to position forces, to anticipate Japanese operations, and to achieve tactical and strategic victories. When the war ended in August 1945, Commander Yoshikawa was still serving in naval intelligence. When American occupation forces arrived in Japan, Yoshikawa was one of the Japanese intelligence officers who were interrogated by American intelligence. During these interrogations, American officers began to reveal the extent of American cryptographic success against Japanese codes. American officers explained that JN-25 had been broken in 1942. American officers explained that American cryptographers had been reading Japanese naval communications throughout the war. American officers explained that the Battle of Midway had been won largely because American intelligence had known Japanese plans in advance. For Yoshikawa, this revelation was both devastating and vindicating. It was devastating because it confirmed that Japanese cryptographic security had failed catastrophically. It was vindicating because it confirmed his wartime suspicions that American intelligence had compromised Japanese communications. In December 1945, American occupation authorities began declassifying some American wartime intelligence documents. These documents were shown to Japanese intelligence officers as part of the education process about why Japan had lost the war. One of these documents was the translated Japanese communications from May 1942 detailing the Midway operation. Yoshikawa read this document and understood immediately that American cryptographers had read Japanese operational plans before the battle began. In the months following the war's end, Yoshikawa began to write a comprehensive analysis of why Japanese cryptographic security had failed and what this failure had meant for the war's outcome. His analysis concluded that Japanese naval intelligence had made several critical errors. First, Japanese cryptographers had overestimated the security of JN-25. They had believed that the mathematical complexity of the code made it unbreakable. They had not accounted for the possibility that determined cryptographers with sufficient resources could break the code through sustained mathematical analysis and pattern recognition. Second, Japanese Naval Command had ignored warning signs that communication security had been compromised. The outcome of battles like Midway suggested that Americans had foreknowledge of Japanese plans. But Japanese command attributed American success to luck or to superior reconnaissance, rather than to cryptographic breaches. Third, Japanese cryptographic procedures had not been updated frequently enough. Even after Midway, when there were strong indications that JN-25 might have been broken, Japanese Naval Command continued to use the same code system, with only minor modifications. This allowed American cryptographers to maintain their advantage throughout the war. Fourth, Japanese naval intelligence had underestimated American cryptographic capabilities. Japanese intelligence had assumed that Americans were not capable of the sustained mathematical analysis necessary to break complex codes. This assumption was based on racial prejudice and on underestimation of American technical and mathematical capabilities. The result of these errors was that American cryptographers maintained a significant intelligence advantage throughout the Pacific War. American commanders knew Japanese plans. American forces could position themselves to ambush Japanese operations. American intelligence could anticipate Japanese strategic decisions.
Yoshikawa's post-war analysis went beyond just explaining why Japanese codes had been broken. He analyzed what this cryptographic failure had meant for the strategic outcome of the war. His conclusion was stark. The cryptographic failure at Midway had made Japanese defeat inevitable. The Battle of Midway had been the turning point of the Pacific War. Before Midway, Japan was on the offensive. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive. Before Midway, Japan had strategic initiative. After Midway, America had strategic initiative. The loss at Midway had occurred because American intelligence had known Japanese plans. American carriers had been positioned in ambush. American dive bombers had struck at the perfect moment. The battle had not been won by superior American tactics or by Japanese mistakes. The battle had been won by American intelligence. If Japanese codes had not been broken, if Japanese communications had been secure, the Battle of Midway might have had a different outcome. Japanese carriers might have achieved surprise. Japanese forces might have destroyed American carriers. The strategic balance in the Pacific might have remained in Japan's favor for months or years longer. But Japanese codes had been broken. American intelligence had read Japanese plans. The battle had been lost before the first shot was fired. Yoshikawa concluded that the war had effectively been lost in June 1942, not because Japan could not have continued fighting. Japan continued fighting for 3 more years, but because the strategic balance had irreversibly shifted. After Midway, American productive capacity and American military strength would inevitably overwhelm Japanese forces. After Midway, Japanese defeat was only a matter of time. One aspect of Yoshikawa's analysis that was particularly painful was his calculation of the human cost of the cryptographic failure. Approximately 3,000 Japanese sailors and pilots died at Midway. But the human cost extended far beyond Midway itself. The loss of 4 carriers and their experienced air crews meant that Japan could not replace these losses quickly enough. The strategic initiative passed to America. American forces went on the offensive. Japanese forces fought defensive battles throughout the Pacific. Over the next 3 years, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and pilots died in battles across the Pacific. Japanese cities were firebombed. Japanese civilians died by the hundreds of thousands. The war ended with atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing more than 200,000 people. Yoshikawa understood that not all of this death and destruction could be attributed solely to the cryptographic failure at Midway, but he also understood that Midway had been the turning point. If Midway had been a Japanese victory, the war might have proceeded differently. Peace negotiations might have occurred. The massive casualties of 1943, 1944, and 1945 might have been avoided. The cryptographic failure that led to defeat at Midway had set in motion a chain of events that resulted in the deaths of millions of people and the destruction of Japan. In 1950, 5 years after the war's end, Yoshikawa published a book in Japan titled The Intelligence Failure: How American Cryptographers Won the Pacific War. The book was based on his post-war analysis and on his interviews with American intelligence officers who had worked on breaking Japanese codes. The book was controversial in Japan. Many Japanese military officers refused to accept that Japanese cryptographic security had failed so catastrophically. Many Japanese civilians did not want to read about Japanese failures. The book sold poorly and was largely ignored. But the book became important among military historians and intelligence specialists. Yoshikawa's analysis was one of the first comprehensive Japanese accounts of why Midway had been lost and what role American cryptographic success had played in the battle's outcome. In the introduction, Yoshikawa wrote what amounted to a confession. "I served as a naval intelligence officer throughout the war. My responsibility was to ensure Japanese communication security and to detect enemy intelligence activities. I failed in this responsibility. I suspected that American cryptographers had broken Japanese codes, but I could not prove it during the war. I wrote reports warning of possible security breaches, but these reports were ignored. The result of this failure was that American intelligence knew Japanese plans throughout the war. American commanders could position forces to ambush Japanese operations. American forces achieved victories that should have been Japanese victories. The Battle of Midway was lost, not because Japanese tactics were poor or because Japanese commanders were incompetent. The battle was lost because American intelligence knew Japanese plans before the battle began. American carriers were positioned in ambush. American dive bombers had struck at the perfect moment. The battle had not been won by superior American tactics or by Japanese mistakes. The battle had been won by American intelligence. I write this account not to justify Japanese actions during the war, but to document how intelligence failures can determine the outcomes of conflicts. I hope that future military planners will learn from Japan's mistakes and will understand that communication security is as important as weapons, tactics, and strategy.
Yoshikawa's book received mixed reactions in Japan. Some Japanese military officers praised his honesty and his willingness to analyze Japanese failures. Some Japanese civilians appreciated his explanation of why Japan had lost the war. But many Japanese people were not ready to accept Yoshikawa's conclusions. Some Japanese military officers argued that Yoshikawa was exaggerating the importance of American cryptographic success. They argued that Japan had lost the war because of American industrial superiority, not because of intelligence failures. They argued that even if Japanese codes had been secure, American productive capacity would have eventually overwhelmed Japanese forces. Yoshikawa agreed that American industrial superiority was a factor, but he maintained that the cryptographic failure at Midway had been decisive in determining when and how Japan would lose. If Midway had been a Japanese victory, the war might have lasted longer. Peace negotiations might have occurred. The final outcome might have been different. American intelligence officers who read Yoshikawa's book praised it as an accurate account of American cryptographic success. Commander Joseph Rochefort, who had led the American cryptographic effort at Station HYPO, wrote a letter to Yoshikawa praising his analysis and confirming the accuracy of his conclusions. Military historians studying the Pacific War began to incorporate Yoshikawa's analysis into their understanding of why Japan had lost. The importance of American cryptographic success at Midway became widely recognized as one of the decisive factors in the war's outcome. Yoshikawa's analysis of the Midway intelligence failure had implications that extended beyond just the Pacific War. His analysis demonstrated the importance of communication security in modern warfare. In World War II, the side that could read enemy communications had an enormous advantage. American cryptographers broke Japanese codes. British cryptographers broke German codes. These cryptographic successes provided intelligence that allowed Allied commanders to anticipate enemy plans and to position forces for maximum effectiveness. The lesson was clear. In modern warfare, communication security is as important as weapons, tactics, and strategy. A military force that cannot protect its communications will lose to an enemy that can read those communications, regardless of how well-armed or well-trained that force might be. This lesson has remained relevant through the decades since World War II. Modern military forces invest heavily in secure communications systems. Modern military planners understand that communication security is a critical component of military effectiveness. Yoshikawa's analysis helped to establish this understanding. His documentation of how American cryptographic success had determined the outcome of Midway demonstrated the strategic importance of communication security. In his later years, Yoshikawa gave interviews to historians studying the Pacific War and the role of intelligence in military operations. In these interviews, he reflected on his personal feelings about the intelligence failure that he had witnessed and that he had been unable to prevent. In a 1975 interview, when Yoshikawa was 78 years old, he was asked how he felt about his role in the war and about the intelligence failure that had contributed to Japanese defeat. Yoshikawa's response was thoughtful and painful. "I was a professional intelligence officer. My job was to protect Japanese communication security and to detect enemy intelligence activities. I failed in this job. I suspected that American cryptographers had broken Japanese codes, but I could not prove it. I wrote reports warning of possible security breaches, but these reports were ignored by my superiors. I have spent 30 years thinking about this failure.
I have asked myself what I could have done differently. I have asked myself whether I could have been more persuasive in my warnings. I have asked myself whether I failed in my professional duty. My conclusion is that the failure was not primarily mine. The failure was systemic. Japanese Naval Command did not take communications security seriously enough. Japanese cryptographers overestimated the security of Japanese codes. Japanese military culture did not encourage junior officers to question the decisions of senior officers. But I also understand that I bear some responsibility. I was an intelligence officer. I suspected that codes had been broken, but I could not prove it. I wrote reports warning of possible security breaches, but these reports were ignored by my superiors. The result of this failure was that thousands of Japanese sailors and pilots died at Midway. The result was that Japan lost the strategic initiative. The result was that the war was prolonged for 3 more years, resulting in millions of deaths. I cannot change the past, but I can document what happened and hope that future military planners will learn from these mistakes. Communications security matters. Intelligence failures can determine the outcomes of wars. Professional intelligence officers must be willing to challenge their superiors when they suspect security breaches. One aspect of Yoshikawa's post-war experience that gave him some measure of satisfaction was the recognition that his wartime suspicions had been correct. He had suspected that American intelligence had compromised Japanese communications. He had been right. In the 1970s, as more American intelligence documents were declassified, the full extent of American cryptographic success against Japanese codes became public. These documents confirmed everything that Yoshikawa had concluded in his post-war analysis. American cryptographers broke JN-25 before Midway. American intelligence had read Japanese communications detailing the Midway operation. American commanders had used this intelligence to position carriers in ambush. The Battle of Midway had been won primarily because of American intelligence superiority. Yoshikawa's analysis was vindicated by these declassified documents. Military historians studying the Pacific War recognized Yoshikawa as one of the few Japanese intelligence officers who had understood what had happened and who had been willing to document it honestly. Takeo Yoshikawa died in 1982 at the age of 85. His book, The Intelligence Failure: How American Cryptographers Won the Pacific War, remained in print in Japan and was eventually translated into English, making his analysis available to international audiences. Military historians studying the Pacific War continue to cite Yoshikawa's analysis as an important primary source about Japanese understanding of American cryptographic success. Intelligence professionals studying communication security use Yoshikawa's analysis as a case study in what happens when communication security fails. Yoshikawa's most important contribution was his honest documentation of Japanese intelligence failures and his analysis of what those failures meant for the war's outcome. Unlike many Japanese military officers who wrote post-war memoirs that minimized Japanese mistakes or blamed others for Japanese defeat, Yoshikawa wrote an honest account that acknowledged Japanese failures and explained their consequences. His central conclusion, that the war was effectively lost in June 1942 when American intelligence superiority was demonstrated decisively at Midway, has been validated by subsequent historical research. While American industrial superiority and American military strength were also important factors in Japanese defeat, the intelligence advantage that America gained through breaking Japanese codes was a decisive factor that shaped the war's course. The lesson of Yoshikawa's analysis remains relevant. In modern warfare, the side that can read enemy communications while protecting its own communications has an enormous advantage. This advantage can be decisive. Communication security is not a secondary concern, but a critical component of military effectiveness. Commander Takeo Yoshikawa understood this lesson too late to prevent Japanese defeat.
but his post-war documentation of this lesson has helped to ensure that future military planners understand the strategic importance of communication security and the catastrophic consequences of intelligence failures.